So I'm a professor of neuroscience at UCL. I also run a neurodesign studio here in London, and we've just also started a startup in Silicon Valley, which is trying to create a digital platform that enables people to re-engage with each other and with the world again. And so all of you are really about seeing differently, about relating meaningfully to people. And if you really want to understand how to relate meaningfully to people, you have to understand how it is the brain actually makes meaning in the first place. So how do we make meaning? And my aim, which is the aim in every single presentation, is I want you to know less at the end than you think you know now. Okay? And I always succeed. So how do we make meaning? And what's at the core of making meaning? And it's perception. And the reason why it's perception is it underpins every single thing that we think, we know, we believe, the clothes we wear, the people we fall in love with. Everything begins with perception. So to understand perception is actually to understand what it is to be human, right? And all of you want to engage with people. So you have to understand what it is to be your audience, what it is to be human. So how many of you, when you woke up this morning, thought you saw the world as it really is? Does anyone see the world as it really is here? No one sees the world as it really is? If not, what are you seeing if you're not seeing the world as it really is? You're seeing what? The black swan. The black swan. So you're seeing a black swan. Are you seeing reality? Are you seeing things accurately?
No, it's what I'm saying. People thought until 800 all swans are white. Until they went to Australia and something like that.
But they could still be seeing that plumage is accurate. So it could, is that interpretation or is it accuracy? The question's, it's a fundamental question. So let's just do a test. How many of you see, how many bears do you see? So how many bears did you see? 3, 5? Okay, anyone else? Keep looking. How many bears do you see? Huh? Oh. There we go. How many bears do you see? Keep looking.
7.
There are 11 bears there. Right? The more you look, the more you see. There's one here, there, big one up in the branches. Right? The more you look at something, the more you'll see. Now, another example, to see if we see reality. How many can see the predator that's about to jump out at you? And of course, if you haven't seen it yet, you're dead. Right? Especially in the front. Can you see it? So 90% of the information your brain uses to see is presented there. It's staring right at you. So this makes a really important point, that when it comes to seeing, your eyes have very little to do with it. Only 10% of the information your brain uses to see comes from your eyes. The other 90% comes from other parts of your brain. Okay? So, anyone want to make a guess where the predator is? What if I add color? What if I add 10% of information? Can you see it now? For those who maybe shouldn't be here, there it is. Okay? Now, know if we go back, you can still see it. It was always there. Okay? So, why? Why don't we see the world as it really is? Why? It comes down to data. Information is completely meaningless, right? There is no inherent value in any piece of information. It is literally meaningless. And this is true even at the senses, right? And the reason is it could mean anything, right? So from the perspective of your brain, there is no inherent value in any piece of data. It doesn't tell you what to do. I'll show you an example. Imagine that this is the back of your eye, and these are 2 projections from the world onto the back of your eye. Okay? They're identical in every single way. Size, shape, spectral content, everything about them is the same. Now, this is the only information that your brain is getting from the world, so as far as your brain is concerned, they should also be the same. Okay? So, the problem is, they come from completely different sources in the world. The one on the right comes from a yellow object in shadow oriented that way, viewed through some pink medium, whereas the one on the left comes from an orange object oriented exactly the opposite direction, under direct light, viewed through a blue medium. Okay? completely different conditions in the world, giving rise to the exact same information. And the reason in this case is because the light that falls onto your eye is conflated by the reflectance of the object, the distance between you and the object, and the illumination of the object. You vary any one of those three real-world parameters, and you change the information. But your brain has no connection to that real world, so it has no idea which one has changed. So even at this most fundamental level, and we're just talking about the light that's falling onto your eye, it's completely meaningless because it could literally mean anything. So how then do we make meaning? How do we see if the information that we're getting directly from the world is meaningless? So how do we see? What's the one piece of information that your brain can use that enables us to generate useful behavior? Memory, your past. In fact, the functional structure of your brain is literally a manifestation of your history. When you look out into the world, you never see what's there because you can't. You're forever separate from that world. And you don't see the information that your senses are getting because it's meaningless. You don't see the data. What you see is what the information meant for your behavior in the past. Okay? And so how do we make meaning? It's through history. It's by literally engaging with the world. There's a particular type of history. It's a physical interaction with it. So I'll tell you a story about two kittens. It's a famous experiment done in the 70s where you take two kittens, eyes recently open, and you take one of the kittens and you put it on the ground, and it runs around perfectly fine, and it's connected to another kitten that's suspended in a basket. So wherever the one on the ground goes, the one in the basket also goes. Okay? So the point is that they get the exact same visual experience of the world. And after about 2 weeks, you take the one on the ground and you test its vision, and it sees perfectly normally. But what about the one in the basket? What does it see? It's had the exact same visual experience. It's blind. It's literally blind. Why? Because it's never been able to physically interact with the world to make sense of the meaningless information that its senses are getting. It's been unable to make sense in any literal way. So it's blind. Okay? So, can we have that spotlight off for a second? Is that possible? So I want to show you how quickly your brain can redefine normality, how quickly it can come see the world in a whole new way. So I want you to notice that two desert scenes are exactly the same in terms of color. One is just a flipping of the other, yes? I want you to stare at the dot between the red and the green. Okay? Stare at this dot. Don't look anywhere else. And we're going to stare at it for 30 seconds. And while you're staring at it, I'll tell you what's happening inside your head. Your brain is learning. It's learning that the left side of its visual field is under green light, and the right side of its visual field is under red. That's becoming its new reality. Which means everything you see after this experience will be a consequence of that recent history of interacting with the world. Okay, so keep staring at it. You're also getting very sleepy. Right? Keep looking. When I tell you to, I'm going to ask you to look at the dot between the desert scenes, but not yet. But when I tell you to. 3, 2, 1, look there. Does it still look the same? Do they change? Some people say that the left one looks like a winter scene, the right one looks like a summer scene, right? For 7% of the men here, it won't change at all. It's because you're color deficient. 7% of the male population is colorblind. They confuse red and green, okay? So that's how quickly, we're just talking about color and seeing light. It doesn't get any easier than that. Even jellyfish see lightness, and they don't even have a brain. Okay. So at this fundamental level, you're able to fundamentally change what you see by interacting with the world. Why? Because your brain evolved to evolve. It evolved to adapt. That's what it's constantly doing. It's constantly modifying itself according to its history of experience. So on the left is a brain cell taken from a rat that was raised in a what's called deprived environment, an environment with very few toys, very few other rats. Okay. The one on the right comes from a rat from an enriched environment with lots of other rats, lots of toys to play with. And you can see that the brain basically adapts to the complexity of its environment. A more complex dynamic world, and its brain cells become more complex and dynamic, increasing the size of its network. A deprived world, a very simple world, and your brain adapts to that to maximize efficiency. It becomes simple. So your brain is constantly adapting to the world that's around it. Okay, so which means that when you open your eyes, what do you see? You simply see what was useful to see in the past. That's all you're ever seeing. You don't see what's there, because you can't. You don't see data, because that's pointless. You only see what this meant for your behavior in the past. But what was useful once may no longer be useful. So you're only ever seeing a history, a meaning. And that history is not just a consequence of you, it's a consequence of your culture, even our evolutionary history. Okay? So, to give you an example of this, I want to use it to do something where it's much more familiar with seeing meaning, which is reading. So, we're going to do a little exercise, because it's morning, it's like class, okay? So I want you to read what you see, okay? So, 1, 2, 3. Very good. 1, 2, 3. Good. 1, 2, 3. The Portuguese in the room. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay, remember the instructions. Read what you see. You all failed. That literally says, "What are reading?" There are no words there. But you all read words. Why? Because because your brain has literally encoded the statistics of co-occurring letters in the English language and other languages. So when you get the context of W space AT, your brain puts an H there because it would have been useful to do so in the past. So it does so again. But there's no law of physics that tells you you have to do that. It was simply because it was useful to do so in the past. So you do so again. None of you read this. What are you dreaming? Why? Because I had you reading. So you read it, what are you reading? You were primed to interpret that context in a particular way. Which means this is true even at the level of seeing color. You see a cube here, and at the top of the cube you see a dark brown tile, and at the side you see a bright orange tile, yes? That's your perceptual reality. But what's the physical reality? If we mask off everything except those tiles, we're not changing those tiles at all, see what happens to your perception. Can we have the light off again? It's just, that's brilliant, thanks. So that's your physical reality, and that's your perceptual reality. Nothing is changing except in your mind. Here you have 4 gray tiles on the left and 7 gray tiles on the right, okay? They're all physically the same. They're all emitting the exact same quality of light. And keep your eye on this one, the one in the front, and see what happens to your perception. We're not going to change it at all. We're just going to change its meaning. So you see 4 blue tiles on the left and 7 yellow tiles on the right. They're all gray. Nothing has changed. They're all physically the same. The only thing that's changing is their meaning, and that's what you're seeing, is the meaning of the information. These 2 tables are the same. Right? The right one is simply the left one on its side. The dimensions of those 2 tables are exactly the same. What you're seeing is not the dimensions. What you're seeing is the meaning of the information. In your past, that stimulus would have suggested different size tables, and that's what you're seeing. So those dimensions are the same. And this is true even when we combine sound with vision. Ooh, that's very loud. Cover your ears for a second. Oof. Okay, so listen to this guy. Do you hear fa? The letter F, fa? Brilliant. Now, on this side, you'll hear ba, okay? Okay, so on the left you hear fa, on the right you hear ba. So if I play this, look back and forth, and you'll hear fa on the left and ba on the right. Yes? So it's changing depending on where you look. Now, Close your eyes. It's the exact same sound each time. Depending on where you look, you hear something different. The sound is never changing. Why? Because if you see his lips making the sound ba, you hear ba. If you see his lips making the sound fa, you hear fa. The sound never changes. It's only changing your mind. Okay? Which means when it comes to seeing the world, we're just like this frog, right? We get information and we generate a behavior that was useful, right? And we do pretty well. We are so like that frog, right? And when things don't quite go our way, we get a bit annoyed, okay? So when it comes to perception, we're always only generating behaviors that were consistent with what was useful in the past. Now, some of you are thinking, I'm not a frog. I've got free will, okay? Well, let's do a test on your free will. I'm going to give you two shapes. You've never really seen these shapes before. They don't have names. They're not circles, diamonds, and triangles. Agreed? So you've never really seen these shapes before. Now I'm going to give you two words that are meaningless. Kiki means nothing, and Boo Boo, which also means nothing. Okay? Now, you independent, free-thinking people, which of these is Kiki, and which of these is Boo Boo? So how many people think Kiki's on the left? And how many think Boo Boo's on the right? Okay? So I read your mind. Just like 98% of the world's population, right? What you don't know is why you're doing this. This is a really important point, which I'll come to at the end. Okay? You can give me a reason for why you're doing this, but almost everyone will be wrong. Which isn't to say it's about ignorance. It's just that we're blind to the assumptions that guide our behaviors. Okay, so more than this, right? We're more than frogs. In fact, what is the thing that actually makes the human mind beautiful? What makes us different from being a frog? And it's that we're delusional, right? This is what makes the human mind beautiful. Now, I'll give you an example. So I'm going to play some sounds, and I want you to try to hear a word or words in these sounds, okay? Can you hear anything from that? Any words? Can you make sense of it? Let's try it again. Anyone want to guess? Sorry? You're on the top of something. What do you think? It's fun to smoke marijuana. You think it's fun to smoke marijuana? See if you can hear it's fun to smoke marijuana. How many people can hear it now? Okay, for those who can't, read along. Can you hear it now? Are you getting better at hearing it? Okay. Notice you're getting better at hearing something that doesn't actually exist. You are delusional. Right? What is that sound? It's simply this, played backwards. So those words don't actually exist in that, but by simply priming you, I can get you to hear something that literally doesn't exist. And what's more, you can train your brain to get better at hearing it. And when I've done this with groups, we had one group, and they worked together, and they came up with one sentence. Another group came up with another sentence, different sentence. And it became impossible for them to hear each other's words. That's culture, the basis of culture, none of which actually existed. But they would swear that those words were what they were hearing. Okay? What we're talking about is really about imagination, the ability to imagine. I want to show you how powerful it is, your imagination, how quickly you can get yourself to see something different by simply imagining something differently. So most of you will see this diamond spinning from left to right. Now I want you to imagine it differently. Imagine it going in the opposite direction. Look around it, blur your eyes, and just imagine it going the opposite direction. And at some point, it'll flip. Look around it, blur your eyes. How many people can get it to flip? For those who haven't, you're imagining looking down on that central plane. There's a central plane there. And you're imagining looking down on it. Now imagine looking up at it. And as soon as you imagine it that way, it goes in the opposite direction. Yes? And you blink and it'll flip. So the question for you, so how many can get it to flip? Right? So the question for you is, which direction is it really rotating? How many people think it's going from left to right? How many from right to left? How many people say, I don't care? Right? What's the real answer? The real answer is that nothing is moving on the screen at all. There is no motion there. There's literally no movement. Yes? It's an animation. You're looking at a series of still images that are slightly different from each other. Your brain is taking those small differences in still images and causing it to appear motion. It's called apparent motion, okay, or phi motion. So your brain is actually taking a series of images that are standing still, creating motion, and then flipping it from one direction to the other, depending on how you imagine it.
Sorry, is that us or is that the actual computer doing that?
That's you. You're doing everything.
So can you see a still picture?
I can't, no. Right?
I want to know if you have secret.
I have secret powers. No. Okay? So your task is really to try to relate meaningfully to your audience, to people. Okay? And what we're talking about is what it is to be human and how the brain actually creates meaning, which is physically interacting with the world, taking meaningless information and making it meaningful. Your brain is constantly telling itself a narrative. That narrative is grounded in the history. But we have a huge problem, especially with digital. In our own research, we've shown that things that are trying to facilitate social interactions, human relationships, are actually decreasing human relationships. So Facebook, Twitter, they actually diminish the value of relationships because they don't do what the brain needs in order to maintain relationships. Okay? So we did an experiment, which is about creating shared experiences in the real world, but using digital. So the question is, how can we do that? So we created something called traces. And what traces enables you to do is to leave messages to someone in the real world. You get the push notification that says, Beau's left you something. It tells you where it is, but not what it is. You literally have to go to that location. You get your phone out, and you see it floating in space in front of you as a drop of water. Okay? And inside that drop of water is a message, a digital message. Okay? A private message that's just for you, sent by someone that you care about. Okay? And what we've shown is that by simply putting messages in the real world and creating an augmented reality interface that enables people to see that as using your phone as a digital window, rather than content being on your phone, it exists in the world. And because it comes from someone you care about, and because you're having to make the effort to go and get it, all these things are fundamental to establishing meaningful relationships between people. And the consequence is that when we run some experiments, that it actually increased the perceived happiness of the people using it, increased their sense of compassion towards each other, and increased that sense of empathy. Because I'm having to think about you, sending you to a location, right? You're making the effort to go and get it. In fact, we've even shown that if you leave pieces of music this way, it increases people's perception of the music itself by 20%. It's called the IKEA effect. Because if I'm making an effort to go and get something, if I make an effort to build something, your brain literally perceives it as being more valuable than if you just passively receive it. Okay? So, who cares? Okay? So here's a more general conclusion, take-home message. So what we're talking about is what it is to be human. Okay? And life is actually really quite basic. Not simple, but basic. When you're walking through life, each of these moments is a decision, a point of decision. Okay? We have an infinite number of points of decision, every single moment. Okay? And every time you make a decision, you're only ever making one choice. Either your brain is deciding to go towards something or away from something. It always just simply comes down to that. It's very, very basic. And what you choose to do, whether you go towards something or away from something, is simply grounded in your assumptions. Those assumptions come from your history of interacting with the world and other people. But that creates a fundamental problem. One, because we're almost completely blind to our assumptions. We're almost completely blind to the reasons why we do what we do. You'll give us a reason, but that reason isn't necessarily always accurate. I'll give you an example. Shout out some three-letter words that you see here. Any three-letter words? Bot, run. Tap. So how many people see sex but don't say it? Okay. How up here? Three-letter words? Yep. Notice that the words you're finding here are different from the words you find in the previous letter string. They're the same letters. What's the assumption that your brain is using that literally determines the meanings that you're pulling from here? It's the assumptions that letters that are next to each other belong to each other. You're using the assumptions of language. You tend to be reading it from right to left. Okay? So another point is that our assumptions are always changing. They change depending on context. People are contextual. Too often in marketing research and different research, we treat people as if they're unitary. But we know that people are constantly changing. We're like an illusion. You change the context and we change. And I can give you an example of emotional context. In 5 minutes, I could put you in different states of power by getting you to remember a stressful time when you were in more or less control. Power is related directly to control. And I get you to imagine that time in incredible detail for 5 minutes. And then you write about it for 5 minutes. And simply after that time, you will see the world differently. You will actually change the movement of your eyes. Where you look in a scene will change. If you're looking at an image and you're a low state of power, you'll look at the background. If you're in a high state of power, you'll look at the foreground. Which means you're literally getting different information from the world depending on how you feel about yourself, which itself alters your experience of the world, which alters what you will see in the future. And that can happen in just 5 minutes, right? You'll see more or less bears depending on your state of power. You'll use letters in that letter string that are further apart in a lower state of power than in a high state of power. These illusions actually increase if you're in a lower state of power. And we're just talking about the perception of color. In just 5 minutes. You'll see pattern where no pattern exists in a low state of power. Okay? So, if you want to understand your audience, you have to understand what it is to be human, which means you have to ask the right questions. And too often, we're asking the wrong question. What are the wrong questions? The who, what, where, when questions. This gives you information. It gives you data, but it doesn't give you meaning. It tells you what someone did, but not why they did it. So if you want to get an understanding of your audience, you have to ask why. Not is it better to be red or blue, but why. Because that enables you to generalize to new contexts. And what's more, you have to ask the questions in the right way. Questionnaires don't work. The reason why they don't work is for 2 reasons. People don't know why they do what they do, and the answers they give you will be aspirational. So research has shown that the answers I give you will be what I want to be true, not what is true. I give you my aspirations, not my reality. So if you really want to understand human behavior, you have to do it in the wild. You have to understand and study how people behave, not the reasons they give you for who, what, where in the behavior. So ask the right question, why, and ask that question in the wild. And if you really want to get people to change their behavior and then facilitate and establish meaningful relationships, then you have to do that in the wild. And you have to actually understand what it is the brain needs to establish relationships, which is shared trust, shared effort, right? Shared intent. So thank you very much. I hope that's useful.
So we're
Any questions?
Running into the break, but maybe we've got time for a couple of questions about this fascinating topic.
Yeah.
I have a small question. What do you recommend, what kind of place or situation to find more inspiration? Like, can you give some suggestions?
Where do I what?
To get more inspiration, to get like new thoughts, like maybe you can give some advices.
New thoughts on, you mean, so?
Just inspiration and the new ways of rethinking things to get away from delusion.
Well, you can never really get away from delusion. But, so this is about creativity. And in my view, there's nothing creative about creativity. Your brain only ever does small steps, okay? And it's only ever stepping to what is the most likely next possibility. When we see someone being creative, what we're really saying is, wow, how did you put those two things together? Because from my perspective, they're a long way away. But for their perspective, it was an obvious next step, right? And we call it the space of possibility, or search space. And that space is defined by their assumptions, just like yours, right? And the reason why their search space is different is because they asked the right questions. They were able to identify their assumptions and then challenge them. And one of the best ways of doing that is groups, and diverse groups. So in our research, we can show that we get far more creative solutions if you put a group of people who have lower average IQ but from more diverse background than a group that has a higher average IQ but from a similar background. But you have to do it in the right context, right? Because the challenge assumptions can be very threatening. So you have to do it in the right context where that actually becomes a useful thing.
Hi, very interesting and extremely intriguing. Just to ask, that was all about colour. What other ways can we change our perceptions? And also, where do we find more information about this?
More information. You can go onto the lab's website. We run a neurodesign studio which brings neuroscientists and designers together to explore these things. And I've done a couple of main stage TED Talks, so you can go there as well. But about color, the reason for looking at color is because it's the simplest thing your brain does. So what's true here has to be true everywhere else, right? But it's true in sound, touch, all of your sensory modalities are this way. But also cognition, so the way I think, the reasons why I give for things, the meanings I attribute to things can change, right? The fundamental aim is to know that you have assumptions, because if you don't know you have assumptions, then you're never going to challenge them, to identify your assumptions, and then to question them. The biggest challenge is question them, because we hate uncertainty. To say I don't know is a terrible thing, right? If you're not sure it's a predator, it's too late. So your brain literally evolved to take what is uncertain and make it certain. So there's a space in which that's possible, which is the space of play, right? That's the evolutionary solution for the brain to deal with uncertainty, is the playful environment.
I want to ask about the digital landscape and how it rewires the brain and how we understand emotions or how decision-making processes change because of how the information is presented to us. That can be in advertising, it can be just information that we read. So do you think as marketers or even as academics, do you think we can use the traditional paradigms of decision-making or even choice-making in general via the traditional paradigms, or do you think in the digital landscape everything is changing and we have to rewire ourselves and our researches for the digital work rather than being exposed to, for example, a billboard in an offline context will affect us differently than seeing a display ad in a social media context, for example. So do you think we need to change our ways of looking at things for the digital campaigns or digital context? Or do you think we can still apply our basic knowledge of decision making or decision sciences or perception in general?
Well, let's see, that's a big one. So in thinking about whether one will need to change the way they do interact with their audience on the digital versus non-digital, well, yes. I mean, take mobile, for instance. The whole concept of using banner ads and advertising is simply using the strategy of attention seeking, right? And in order to grab attention, there are certain strategies that you can do. It's about contrast, it's about difference, things like this. But actually in the mobile world, that's not a very meaningful thing. In fact, the mobile, we typically, all the information we're getting there is typically the same stuff we get on our computer. So we're actually tethered to the computer. We're just trying to take it with us, rather than making the mobile mobile. So in that case, and this is what why Traces was created, to enable us to actually use the mobile in the real world, to actually make it mobile. So to give a window into a world that's actually out there. And we're doing it through providing gifts for people. And so the brands are working with us in leaving gifts for the audience that they can reshare. So that's the way we're approaching that. So yes, I'd say yes, it has to change.
Hi, I was just curious to know a bit more about Traces.
Yeah.
You mentioned that it improved people's sort of happiness levels, and I was keen to understand how you measure that. And also, you mentioned also that with the music example, it improved people's sort of perception of value of music. I think in the brand world, we'd probably use something quite prescriptive, like brand uplift measures. But is there anything more exciting we could use sort of in the cognitive world, like MRI or skin conductivity or anything like that?
Yeah, so MRI won't tell you anything. But, but there are some, so we use quite literally perceptual measurements. So how does it literally change the way people are seeing things and hearing things? So those are the types of measures we use. And there are also some very standard cog-sci, neurosci ways of looking at well-being, sense of well-being, happiness, and these types of things. But a lot of our measures are just literally perception changes. People literally see things differently. So, but if you wanted to talk about it, we can. And so so we set up our experiments in that way. Yeah.
Okay, let's give Dr. Beau Lotto another hand.